Picking up from where we left off in part 1 of module 62, you can see that under a natural monopoly, okay, several things. First of all, the socially optimal quality, or quantity, I should say, rather, with no deadweight loss would be at Q, where marginal cost is equal to the price, and that would be demanded at and the quantity that would be demanded at that price, and there is no deadweight loss there. Now, for the natural monopoly, they would want to charge a price that would get them a fair return. So if we look at where marginal revenue equals marginal cost for the monopolist, you can see that that price would be much higher. And the unregulated price for the monopoly would be PM. But the fair return price would be where price is at the minimum of average total cost, and that would be a fair return price. So we have to ask ourselves, when we regulate a natural monopoly, if they're unregulated, the price is going to be much higher. So if we set a price ceiling, do we set it at the fair return price or the socially optimal price with no deadweight loss? Here's a video from AC/DC Econ and Mr. Clifford on deadweight loss. Here's an activity that we'll do in class on deadweight loss. Here's a video on AC/DC Econ where Mr. Clifford explains the socially optimal price and compares it to the fair return price for a regulated monopoly. And so, how do we prevent monopoly power? Some monopolies arise due to mergers and acquisitions of rival companies. Sometimes they combine together. One will buy the other out. Or it could be due to ownership of a critical production input. So our government here in the United States has antitrust laws to deal with the harmful effects of these types of monopolies. But other monopolies are created by massive economies of scale. And these are called natural monopolies, and they exist when the average total cost of producing the entire market demand is lower if only one firm exists than they would be if several smaller firms existed. If this is the case, it is more efficient to allow the natural monopoly to exist, but for the government to regulate it and limit the price it can charge to prevent abuse of pricing power and to limit the sizable deadweight loss. So, suppose a natural monopoly exists in the local electricity market. The producer, Duck Energy, is so large that the average total cost of producing electricity is lower than would be the case if the government broke Duck into several small competing firms. But we saw above that monopoly pricing power creates problems for consumers and a loss of total welfare. So how can the government deal with this natural monopoly? Well, one way they can deal with it is through public ownership. Instead of the company being privately owned, it could be owned by the government. It could be a public corporation. The government could purchase Duck Energy and operate the firm itself. The advantages seem clear, because the government is not in the business of maximizing profit at QM and PM. Prices charged by the government should be lower to electricity consumers. If the government could operate the electricity market where the price was equal to marginal cost, there would be no deadweight loss. Downsides to a public option, though, exist. The government, as a very large bureaucracy with many other issues to deal with, is not always the best entity at keeping costs low. Sometimes there is waste. Sometimes there are political favors that may cause electricity rates to rise and taxpayer money to be wasted. Another commonly used option to regulate the market for electricity would be price regulation, to set a price ceiling on what the monopoly can charge. In other words, Duck Energy gets to operate the power plants and deliver electricity to the people, but the government dictates the rates which can be charged. We do this here in Colorado, Xcel Energy is not allowed to charge whatever price it wants for electricity and gas to consumers. It is regulated by the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. And when they want to raise the price, they have to go before the Public Utilities Commission, explain why they want a rate increase, and justify it to the PUC. And sometimes the PUC allows it, sometimes they allow part of it, sometimes they don't allow any of it. So that's one strategy for dealing with it. And we can see that how this might occur. What happens if the government sets a price ceiling to get the socially optimal output? Well, if it does that, the firm would make a loss, because at that price, if the firm would be going up to its average total cost curve at that price, and that would represent an economic loss for the firm. So that might be good for society, but it might be unfair to the firm. So that option isn't always the best one. In this graph, we are assuming that a large fixed cost exists. Imagine huge power plants. And the variable cost of providing another unit of electricity is very small and constant. This creates, you can see, a downward sloping ATC curve with huge economies of scale and a lower constant marginal cost curve. Now, unregulated, Duck Energy produces QM as the quantity, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and it would charge a price of PM. The firm would be earning positive economics at the point where you take the price, the market price, subtract it from the average total cost, and that's seen in the shaded rectangle. Consumer surplus would shrink and deadweight loss would exist because the market price is greater than marginal cost. Now, the government can regulate Duck Energy in a couple of different ways. It could regulate it to the perfectly competitive outcome. If it did that, the output would be QC and the price would be PC. Consumer surplus, you could see, would be maximized. There would be no producer surplus, but consumer surplus would be at its maximum. There would be no deadweight loss because price would be equal to marginal cost. But the firm would suffer losses because that price would be below its average total cost, and it would have economic losses. Because society does not want to bankrupt the only electricity provider in the area, this regulation, while it would be most efficient, would not be chosen, the socially optimal price. Instead, it would be regulated in a way that the firm would earn a normal profit, or where price would be equal to average total cost. Economic profit would be zero at PR, that price, where it's equal to average total cost. So consumer surplus would be larger than without regulation. Notice how much smaller the consumer surplus would be at the unregulated price of PM and QM. But at the fair return price, where price is equal to the firm's average total cost and it earns a normal profit, that's reducing consumer surplus a little bit than it would be at the socially optimal price, but much greater than it would be at the unregulated price, and it allows the monopoly to earn a normal profit. So some deadweight loss exists because PR is greater than the marginal cost, but not as much as would exist if the firm were unregulated. So this second option is a compromise between the unregulated monopoly outcome, which would be worst for consumers and create the most deadweight loss, and the perfectly competitive outcome, which would be best for consumers with zero deadweight loss, but it would bankrupt the monopoly firm. Here you can see the difference between an unregulated and a regulated natural monopoly. So when natural monopoly exists, because of its producing with economies of scale and at the lowest average total cost, we want to allow that monopoly to exist, but not to be unregulated, because that creates the most deadweight loss and the least amount of consumer surplus, and also reduces the quantity supplied in the market by much more. The regulated price would be the fair return price rather than the socially optimal price, where the firm would earn a normal profit, but consumer surplus would be much greater and the quantity produced much greater than in an unregulated situation, and the price would be lower than an unregulated situation. But it's not the best that we would get as under perfect competition, not the most efficiency. But it's a compromise between the two. And that's how the government would choose to regulate a natural monopoly. Now, on the AP exam, you may be asked to explain what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss when a monopoly is regulated. So be prepared to do that, and remember that a regulated price equal to the average total cost is the lowest price that would not cause the firm to take economic losses and eventually close and shut down. Here's an activity we'll do in class on monopoly and inefficiency. Here's a video from ACDC Econ where Mr. Clifford explains the difference between a lump sum tax and a per unit tax on profits. And here's an example from the cable industry. Until recently, local cable TV was a natural monopoly, a company like Comcast. It ran cable through running cable through a town. It entailed such large fixed costs that it had economies of scale, and it didn't depend on how many people actually subscribed. So at first, cable TV was subject to price regulation. But in 1984, Congress passed a law that prohibited most local governments from setting price ceilings and regulating cable prices. When that happened and the price ceiling was removed, because it was a monopoly, cable prices went up sharply. And so local governments had to set limits on cable prices. The cost of basic service leveled off. And although cable TV is a monopoly, now there have emerged other providers, such as satellite companies like DirecTV and Dish Network, and fiber optic internet providers and other companies like Verizon and AT&T, who have caused prices to drop significantly because of competition in the TV industry. Here's an activity we'll do on monopoly in a perfectly competitive market. Here's a question from the AP exam, 2008, the audit exam. And so here's a summary of what we've learned in this module. And this concludes our look at Module 62 on monopoly and public policy.